Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is our 30th Cold War Spaces. I'm Anna Rose, Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us. Today's topic is Secession Space, Ukraine's Path to Independence. Our guest today is Katya Soldak. She's a New York-based journalist, born and raised in Ukraine. She works as an editorial director for Forbes magazine's international editions and previously worked in documentary production. A Columbia School of Journalism alumna, she's interviewed high-profile politicians and artists and has written cover stories for Forbes about Ukrainian and Russian oligarchs. She's the author of the memoir essay, This Is How Propaganda Works. We've shared that in the past, so you might have heard of it, about growing up in the Soviet Union. She directed the feature-length documentary, The Long Breakup, about Ukraine's path to independence, told from the perspective of herself, her family, and her friends. It was filmed over the course of more than a decade. And as attendees of this event, you should have already received the exclusive link to view the film along with a password. And if you haven't viewed it already, it'll be available through this Sunday. And it's a fascinating film, so we highly recommend, especially after watching this program. And today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Katya and Joes Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, there'll be about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen during that time. And as always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but please keep them concise and no longer than a sentence or two so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for other comments or discussion, please use the chat box. As we're getting started, feel free to say what city you're tuning in from. I see some LA and San Diego folks already in the chat box. And please remember to switch the blue button to panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your messages, not just us. And as always, we'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page. And I'd like to announce that we're also launching this series in podcast format. We've posted a selection of our past recordings to our SoundCloud for audio-based listening if you prefer, or if you missed any of those in the past. And we'll be posting all the ones going forward as a podcast. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And Joes, I'll hand it off to you to get started. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Anna Rose. And let me start by echoing what you said about the documentary, The Long Breakup, which is really fascinating. And I watched it with great pleasure and learned a lot. So welcome, Katya, to our program. Let me start with the part where you talk about your youth in Kharkiv in eastern Ukraine. You mentioned the oath of the young pioneers, always be ready, and you talk about your love for Lenin. Can you start telling us a little bit, first of all, what you were supposed to be ready for, and also what this feeling for Lenin actually meant? What kind of feeling was that?
Well, thank you so much for this question. And first of all, I would like to thank you and Anna Rose for such a wonderful introduction and for having me here and to give me an opportunity to talk about my youth. You can imagine, as people get older, they like to talk about their younger years. And at least I have a good reason to think about those years.
Absolutely.
So,
yep.
Growing up as a little Octoberist and then as a young pioneer, I don't think I personally questioned what it was. I know a lot of people my age, they were not as politicized as I was, but I think I was easily excitable and I, believed in the party, even though I was a tiny child. So the slogan, I don't think I even thought what it meant. I just wanted to be part of that group. And because I was a straight A student, I got accepted into this group of young communists, young pioneers, one of the first people. I was so proud, I don't even know how to describe. So anything that it entailed, all the group gatherings and marching and books and ideals, and even some little local community work, like within the classroom, or at some point I was like the leader of that classroom group, whatever, like Atriad it was called. I took it very seriously. I thought that we were doing something very, very good. And the love for Lenin, it wasn't like like
You were
genuine.
not in love with him.
It was admiration. It's
Right.
kind of like a cult in a way. I just remember how some children in our, because I lived in a building with like 40 apartments, and all the children were like unsupervised running around, and occasionally an older child would be organizing us and talking for some reason about like politics or news. I don't know if
Mhm.
it was common for other people my age, but that's what happened occasionally. She would bring, like, this girl would bring a piece of newspaper, and she would be like, okay, look, this leader of the free people died. Let's say like Yuri Andropov died, and she would talk to us about it. She was nobody. She was just a kid. So everybody was slightly brainwashed. And then we were talking about Lenin, and one boy suggested that, you know, Lenin is like a dead body that's there in the Kremlin. And everybody who heard it, we were like, don't say that, that's horrible. And then I would think when they put the balm on him to preserve him as a mummy, they might have to touch certain body parts. And just thinking that would give me shivers. I'm like, how could I? It's like such a, you know, so horrible. How did I get that thought? So that love was not just, you know, I didn't even know much. It was more about idolizing and, you know, constant presence in our lives.
Right, right. So there is a lot of history of Ukraine in your documentary, and we'll get to that. But I think a key concept throughout the documentary is the question about identity. And I wanted to ask you, you interviewed the historian Timothy Snyder in your documentary, and he says to be part of a nation, you have to have a sense of community and also a sense where that community is going, future orientation. I was struck by that and wonder if you agree with him that speaking about national identity or cultural identity, looking into the future is actually more significant than looking back into the past.
I think, I mean, it's just my amateur, you know, I'm not a historian. I didn't study in depth these subjects of identity and what constitutes that. I think different people might have a different opinion on this because there are plenty of Ukrainians who live abroad. They were born in America or in Canada, but they speak Ukrainian very well, and they help Ukrainian communities, you know, either local or in Ukraine. They may never consider moving to Ukraine and living there, but in a way they cherish the culture, the music, food, you know, that makes them Ukrainians or Ukrainian-American, Ukrainian-Canadian. But also, I think there is also a group of people who would consider moving and living in their, you know, respected country. Maybe, you know, Russians who were born here, they would consider, maybe not right now, but at certain point, or like in the 90s, people who lived abroad, they came back to Russia, to Georgia, to Ukraine, to, you know, participate in building new countries, and that would boost their identity and connection with their countries. And
Right.
in my case, it's a little, you know, I lived there exactly half of my life, and I have not given up on the idea of moving back, but at least having some kind of connection, you know, physically living half and half or something. So in that case, I do identify my future with Ukraine, not just because my roots, I don't even know what they are. I was raised half of my life in like Soviet Union when I lived there, not half, but the first half of my life. But I think that identifying with the future of the nation is probably a very refreshing and very proactive way, because it also gives you like a path in doing something, to not just thinking about what happened, but also proactively doing something with the future
Right.
associated with your country.
Right, right. So you grew up not only with a love for Lenin, but also a love for Russian songs, literature, music, etc. And I wonder, since at a certain point in your life you identified specifically with Ukraine, how did it affect your view of these Russian songs and Russian literature? Do you still consider them to be part of your cultural identity, or is that different now?
I think it transformed into something different. I think that the fact that my family was sort of like, I would say right now, multicultural. My grandfathers and my grandmother, my father's side, they all from Belarus and Poland, and I do have some Ukrainians on my mother's side, but also the Russian side was very present. But unfortunately, when I grew up in the Soviet Union, we didn't have any like countryside in Ukraine where I would get connected with local Ukrainian traditions and cultures. So I spent half of my summer in Belarus and half of my summer in Russia, and I did not speak Ukrainian language well. So naturally, I would read and learn in Russian. So Ukrainian was harder for me to practice because I didn't have the environment where I would speak, except for the school. And all the songs, they were Soviet. The propaganda from the Soviet Union was so strong. They would, all the channels that we had, they were in Russian. They were forced upon you. And when I say all the channels, we literally had, like, in my family, 2 channels, 2.5, because one we could never really catch it with this antenna, but one was like channel 1 in Russian, all about the Soviet Union, the party in Russian language. And then there was Ukrainian channel that was in Ukrainian, but it was not that interesting. It didn't show all the major films that we wanted to see, so it was secondary. Right. I majored when I lived in Ukraine, I majored in Russian. I think my degree was like Russian literature or some world literature, but Russian took a big part of it, and English. So I studied Russian and Russian literature. I mean, I know.
Does it make a difference for you that Russian literature is not Ukrainian literature? Does it create a kind of distance, or is that just a theoretical concept?
Well, when I say Russian literature, I mean all the classics, right? I mean, Leo Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, all these big names that everybody knows. But I was fortunate that when I was living in Ukraine as a teenager, and we started taking, Ukrainian literature, they already changed all the books from Soviet books to new books. So we were able to study when I was 14, 15, actual Ukrainian writers that were, and poets that were banned or not published during the Soviet times. And the teacher that we had, she was very, she loved Ukraine so much that she gave us usually a little bit more. She was trying to teach us the actual history. So even though at that time, and I'm talking like 1991, 92, 93, in Kharkiv, and it's not the most like pro-Ukrainian city, people were skeptical of what she was teaching. I think she still gave me personally so much information. And I think that's partially why, for me, yes, Russian literature, I loved it, but I was also familiar with like fresh things that were not permitted during the Soviet Union time. And now I do have more interest in Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture. It's all about like, the mass information and propaganda and giving the information to children at a very young age. So if you only fed Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, yes, you think that these are great writers, and they are, but they're also amazing writers that were banned or not published or, persecuted and basically not permitted to read and to study.
Right. And speaking about banning, I mean, growing up in Soviet schools with history lessons, of course, there's a lot that was left out, like the artificial famine in Ukraine brought about by Stalin, but also like the Holocaust, the gulags, the August 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop non-aggressive pact between Hitler, Germany, and Stalin, things like that. When was the moment that you started to learn about these aspects of the shadow history of the Soviet Union? Was that after the breakup or already before?
After the breakup. Partially, maybe it coincided with the age when they would teach us, because I was a teenager right when the Soviet Union fell apart, and that's when they changed the books. And we had, at least in my school, my teacher taught us a realistic account of Ukrainian history, and she talked about Holodomor. until then, I'm not sure. I know that people were, because in Kharkiv was affected by Holodomor, and people were just telling each other stories about, cannibalism, some hunger stories. So people kind of knew, but I don't think it was taught in schools. But by the time I was at that age when I could actually learn about it, we already had, there was freedom to talk about it. But speaking a little bit more in general, and I don't think I was the most ignorant person when I lived there, because I read, I had a lot of curiosity. I don't think I've ever heard of Holocaust, to be honest, because the Soviet history was not big on talking about these things. And also the World War II started in, 1941, June 22nd. Nobody ever talked about the role that Stalin and Hitler played in starting it together. And even in, 15 years ago, I would still have arguments with some members of my family about when the war started, who won the war, because it was the Soviet history was so strong, and it's just so embedded in people's heads that even in like 2005, 2004, I still sounded like this brainwashed American who's, betraying whatever my past and my history was. Even with my own mother, we had arguments about that. And then, of course, with more information, she changed her views. But I think in Ukraine, 4 or 5 years ago, right after the Maidan revolution, they started openly talking about when the World War II started and what it was. But I'm pretty sure there are still plenty of people who do not share 100% the real history account.
Right. So in that sense, Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, of openness, since the mid-1980s was not that effective on all levels, I understand. Is that right?
Well, I think on some levels it was, right? Because they started publishing books that were not allowed. Like I remember these magazines from 1989 when they would publish Solzhenitsyn and some other authors. And that's when I started reading, even though it was not meant for kids, but like what else was there to do? There was only one TV channel to watch. So I read anything that came my way, and kind of, you educate your brain in a slightly different way. So maybe in terms of teaching the masses, the people about facts of history, there was not a good job done. But in terms of permitting the mixture and diversity of voices in literature and art, especially, Ukrainian art, Ukrainian literature, that was open.
Right. So in the 1990s, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine, you worked as a television reporter in Kharkiv. Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences there? How free were the media? How open were they? Was there corruption? Was there political control? Was there censorship? How did it work?
Now when I look back, I think the way I would describe it, it was very amateur, because there was nothing to really, there was no legacy of, television. I worked for newspapers, for television. It was wild, wild west. You could do anything you wanted, because the Soviet, kind of legacy vanished. Nobody wanted to do the party line. It was gone. The Western standards, occasionally we would have I remember somebody would give me like a printouts of how BBC reporting is done, but it's not like I went to school to study. So you just report about things the way you wanted. And even though there was no censorship in a traditional way, because the government wouldn't censor anything, it was a private company, but we would still cater towards the needs of the owner of the station. At least there was a brief moment when I participated in newsmaking when he was, the owner was running for some position in the parliament, and everything we did was to accuse the government and doing a bad job and somehow, showing the channel's owner in a good light that, yes, things can get better. But, I was naive in many ways. And I remember we did some news segments. We covered some, Chernobyl and people who suffered during Chernobyl. And we openly talked about how they don't get any help. And I think, at that time, it seemed like Chernobyl was a long time ago, but now I think it was only like 11 years after. So a lot of people were getting sick and they were, their health was deteriorating and the government did not do anything or did very little. So I think I remember doing something about it and thinking, okay, we're going to expose it and maybe something will be done. But nothing was done. Nobody cared about anything.
Right, interesting, yeah. So the 21st century is still young, but Ukraine already experienced two revolutions. The Orange Revolution in 2004, and then you already mentioned it, the Euromaidan revolution of 2013-14. Okay, I know this is a big question, but can you try to briefly indicate what these revolutions were about and what is the difference between them?
Well, they both were about Ukraine's direction and the need for a better future. And I think the association of better future was with Europe and European Union. Ukraine is very close to Europe, and maybe the east of Ukraine is not, at least it wasn't as exposed to Europe, but the West, they traveled all the time, they're so close, and people could see how life is a little bit, better and, more interesting and economically is better in Europe. And a lot of young people in Ukraine wanted to travel and they wanted to see Europe and they wanted to have similar lifestyle and quality of life in Ukraine. So it was part of the separation from the Soviet Union, from the past, and an attempt to create its own future. And in 2005, 2004, 2005, it wasn't as profound as during Euromaidan of 2013-14. But I think it was one of the steps in that direction. And it was more political about EU versus, Russia. And I think in 2013, 2014, it was not so much. I know it started as the decision between the direction, between which direction Ukraine is going to go. But I think when a lot of people came out, it was more about the right to determine their own future and their own path. And they didn't want to live in corruption, in this, the gangster government hurt too many people who maybe were apolitical, but they didn't want to continue like that. They had no way to live the way things were, and they wanted to determine their own future. So it was more, I think it was like the change was more profound and more internal. And that also created the environment in which finally the statues of Lenin and the communist symbols came down, which didn't happen during 2004, 2005.
And that was at the time you were no longer in love with Lenin, I assume.
Well, I fell out of love with Lenin in 1991.
Right.
And
so let me ask you, of course, there is this split, you could say, in Ukrainian politics between a tendency towards Russia and an opposite tendency towards Western Europe or Europe in general. You are, as mentioned, from Kharkiv, which is quite close to the Russian border. Can you tell us a little bit about the discussions in that city and also the impact of the Russian annexation of the Crimea in 2014? What impact did it have on the atmosphere in the city and the discussions in the city?
It's true that Kharkiv is on the border with Russia, and the ties between people in Ukraine and Russia in that area are very close. Even in my own family, my stepfather, who is in the film, he has family in Belgorod, which is, like, I don't know, an hour and a half away, but it's Russia. So you can't really build a wall between these regions and say, you know, this is one country, this is another, you can't talk to each other, but there is a difference. There's still a difference because certain things, when Russia, for instance, was tightening the screws and the Kremlin regime was getting stronger, even my stepfather would be concerned how his, I think, nephew in Belgrade would be whispering, "You have to talk about Kremlin or Putin," because he was afraid. Just, you know, in Ukraine, they were not afraid of anything. They could say whatever they wanted. And an hour and a half away, there was a family who wouldn't even joke about their own leader. So the differences started sort of building up over the time. And when the revolution happened in 2013, you know, people definitely had to start thinking, you know, about differences and siding with Ukraine. And I think the annexation of Crimea, it's not, I mean, I live in New York. It's harder for me to speak on behalf of Ukrainian people and the feelings that they had. But I also have a place in Crimea that's very dear to my heart. And I love that place and I want to go. And I even, while I lived here in the United States, I traveled 3 times, I think, to visit that place. I want to go, but I can't because Crimea is annexed. So I do have some kind of personal regret that it happened, but it was more about the violation of the international law or any kind of law. Who does that? You come and take the land away in the 21st century. It's really strange. And I think that also made it clear how different, you know, the ways are between Ukraine and imperial Russian thinking. Like they have a huge country. Why do they need more land? It's harder to understand if you live like a normal state. You don't think about like grabbing lands and empowering, you know, yourself through like the size of your territories, and then it happens and your territory is taken. It's kind of very, very strange and shocking.
Right. So let me ask you one more question before we go to the Q&A. In 2015, there was this television series, Servant of the People, and a certain Vladimir Zelensky, an actor and comedian, impersonated the president of Ukraine in that series. But then in May 2019, the same Zelensky actually became president of Ukraine with his party called Servant of the People. So, and of course he came in the news due to his infamous phone call with then President Donald Trump, which led to Trump's first impeachment. But how do people in Ukraine view Zelensky? Do they take him seriously as a politician? And what would you say is his view for the future of Ukraine?
Oh, you know, I mean, that's one of the rare situations when life is imitating art, when the fictional president became a real president. And I think that it was just basically a statement against establishment. Ukrainian people just wanted to, you know, for various reasons, but some of them just wanted to, you know, it's like a joke. They just thought that electing him would basically show to the rest of the establishment that they're fed up with all these political games. But he was not the greatest choice for Ukraine. I think his policy is very inconsistent. His appointments of people is very inconsistent. I'm not saying that he brought Ukraine back to Russia, but some of the key figures that he appointed, they had very questionable past. And also, it's not that he completely derailed Ukraine, but the progress is also not there. Just yesterday, he banned 3 pro-Russian TV channels, which is a great move, but he only did it now. And, you know, information war in Ukraine has never stopped. Since the Maidan revolution, Russia keeps pushing certain agendas, certain thoughts, confusing people. And they maybe don't do it in like black and white way, but they do this micro-targeting when they just confuse people just enough to make them question everything that's happening. And it depends on the region. So they target Kharkiv in a very special way because they know that people are going to, more susceptible to certain views, but they wouldn't use it against people in the west of Ukraine. They would do something different. But the major channels were still broadcasting in, not a very pro-Ukrainian agenda. So hopefully that move would do something.
Okay, thank you. So it's time to move to the Q&A, and please put your questions under the Q&A box, not the chat, because that's where I'm looking for them. At this point, there are no questions yet, so that gives me the opportunity to maybe ask you one more question, and that is about the role of propaganda. You actually wrote an article or an essay, "This is how propaganda works," and you describe your personal experiences from a young age, how systemic propaganda can actually construct a sense of unbreakable loyalty and blur the border, so to speak, between what is rhetoric and what is real life. So we are obviously experiencing a kind of crisis in terms of information at this point, for instance, in the United States with the whole fake news discussion, etc., and incredibly radicalized bipolar situation in terms of worldviews. What would you, given your experience with propaganda, advise us in the United States at this point of how do you see this crisis based on your own personal history?
It's always interesting to see how information influences people. And in the Soviet Union, it was highly controlled. So all the information that was different from the party line, it was eliminated for many decades, brutally. People, free thinkers, people more, intellectual, they would be either sent to gulag or silenced in a certain way. All the banned literature was not forbidden. People could get punished for reading certain books. It's slightly different now because social media is everywhere. People have access to information. It's very hard to completely ban, but yet people still choose to read what they want to read. And if they read something that's outside of their bubble, they don't believe. And I think certain people, the propagandists, they use it to push certain messages and agenda and creating this completely false narrative that is not real. And we've seen it in the United States. It's amazing how it works. I'm sure that there will be studies on what makes certain people believe certain things, like conspiracy theories, or like this stuff about the pedophiles. It's almost unbelievable, but yet people believe. So there's, I think, deeper psychological involvement and how it gets affected. But I think facts, this is what matters. Like if anyone genuinely wants to understand why this is false, they need to go to the bottom to find the original source, to find a study or to find some facts that are provided by legitimate agency, not just some Instagram screen grab or like somebody says something, but find the source and determine the credibility of that source. And that's how you would know if certain data is more likely to be correct than not correct.
Right, okay. We have some questions now. David Edick asks, how has political turmoil in Belarus affected Ukraine and the image of Europe and Russia?
Yeah, actually, thank you for this question. I was going to mention something about Belarus because I think Belarus is going through something similar to what Ukraine went through over the course of the past couple of decades and these two revolutions. And this uprising definitely made people more aware of their own independence and the future. And I don't know if it affected Ukraine per se, but I think there is a certain unity between people who already went through something and people who are going through something. And I do have contacts in Belarus, and I speak to them, and I just spoke recently. And I think the understanding is that even at the beginning of this uprising, Belarusians were not really against Russia. They just wanted honest elections, fair elections. They wanted to get rid of this dictator of 20 years and have, you know, more like whatever freedom to choose and have a legitimate government. But watching how it's all not going anywhere and how Russia sent their pro-Russian journalists to cover things in a certain way to create yet another account of completely false narrative, they started turning against Russia too. Not really like in a very open way, but they don't want to be associated with that. They don't like that. They want freedom. And unfortunately for Russia, freedoms to choose, freedom to live the way you want, economic freedoms, they are not associated with Russia. They are associated with democratic countries or, you know, Western countries. So in that sense, I think Belarusians are also getting their stronger national identity. And it's not that they're fighting against Russia, they're just going forward. But Russia, you know, just yesterday they sentenced the opposition leader Alexei Navalny to 3.5 years in prison, and many people came out into the streets. What is happening? You know, you can't keep millions of people under this iron fist, you know, under control when they clearly are ready for something else. So it's a very interesting moment in both countries, in Russia and in Belarus.
No, absolutely. And actually, we had a Cold War Spaces interview about Belarus with Sasha Razor, who I think is with us today. So anyone interested in the topic, please check it out on our website. The next question is from Rick Feldman. How did most of the people in Crimea feel about the Russian land grab? It seems as though many were okay with it, question mark.
You know, it depends on who you listen to. If you listen to pro-Ukrainian people who stayed in Crimea or Crimean Tatars, I know they're not happy about it. I know they see a lot of violation of human rights, and even economically they're suffering. And then if you talk to Russians who don't see anything wrong about that, they would only describe it as a good thing. Some people actually could capitalize on this annexation because their businesses, you know, that maybe didn't do well at that time before Russia took over, they somehow boosted, and they obviously are probably in favor of it because they're making, you know, better profit. So
Right.
there probably, we should probably have some objective measurements to, you know, to understand how people feel. But I do believe that if local native Crimean Tatars are oppressed, it can't be good, you know, it's wrong.
Right, thank you. Next question is from Nathan Ayala. Did you ever visit or work on the children's railway in Kharkiv as a pioneer or adult? Children's railways were educational institutions made to teach pioneers members railway professions.
Well, and what is the question again?
So did you ever visit or work on the children's railway?
My parents were so busy that they never took me to that. And I actually asked them a while ago why it never happened, but I know what it is. And funny to say, I had a brief moment in my youth, like 1994, when I was participating in a music video by this Ukrainian artist. And it was shot there. So I have this video from 1994, this like for 10 minutes is showing a lot of snow and the railroad and this children's little trains. I know what you're talking about, but never participated, unfortunately.
Right, right. Next question is from Ilya Godes. What kind of government does Ukraine need to achieve the prosperity level of its European neighbors?
I mean, I wish I could answer that question with competence, but not really, it's not really my subject, but I do believe that judicial reform could make a big difference to create independent courts, because right now they're not. And once you have independent courts, you can talk about separation of different entities and institutions from, and creating, road out of corruption. And at this point, after Zelensky took over, I don't think anything happened progressively in that direction.
Right. Next question is from Dexter Laviolette. The national identity of modern Ukraine seems to be significantly influenced by the turmoil after World War I. There were a confusing amount of factions, nationalist, white, red, black back then, with a seeming revolving grip on power. But how do you think have they influenced modern concepts of Ukrainian national identity? And how is it different in different parts of Ukraine?
It's such a complicated question. In the west of Ukraine, they didn't participate in the Soviet Union. They didn't join until after the World War II. So even though they were affected by all the other countries that they were part of, Poland, maybe Hungary, there was still, it was not killed by the Soviets. But I think between the World War I and World War II, the eastern part of Ukraine, or that part that was occupied by the Soviets, they worked really, really hard on getting rid of Ukrainian identity and all the people who could bring with them, prosperity to Ukrainian identity. By manipulating, by killing people, by promising, for instance, the communist government in Kyiv that they will allow Ukrainian national identity. They got that part into the Soviet Union, but then they killed all of those people and replaced them with the new ones who did not promote anything Ukrainian. I think little by little, they got Ukrainian identity under control. Even in Kharkiv, even if you look at some of the signs from the World War II, like the shops and the announcement and posters, they are in Ukrainian. But by the time I lived in Kharkiv, people didn't really speak a lot of Ukrainian. It was basically treated as some kind of low culture countryside language, like folk songs. They didn't really promote sophisticated culture in Ukrainian. Now it's back. But in the Soviet Union, that's part of this whole conversation. It was not forbidden because you really can't completely kill, but it was set aside as something that you do in the countryside. But in the city, if you want to be sophisticated, you speak Russian.
Right. David Eric asks if you can explain the Surgic language, which he writes, seems to be a dynamic blend of Ukrainian and Russian.
In Kharkiv, for instance, they speak very pure Surgic.
Uh-huh.
But I think it's normal in a way that different regions of a big country, and Ukraine is not a small country. Ukraine used to be 50 million people. Now they say it's like 40 or around 40 million people. The different regions have slightly different version of Ukrainian. And it's natural that in the east side, maybe Ukrainian gets mixed a lot with Russian. But also if you go to small villages in Kharkiv or outside of Kharkiv, they speak Ukrainian. They don't speak Surgic. They actually speak like babushkas, these old ladies who don't really listen to the radio and they don't know about the information wars. They speak Ukrainian language, maybe it's slightly different from the way they speak it in the west side of Ukraine, of course, because it's influenced by Hungary, by Poland, by other bordering language groups. And Surgic is, Surgic is Surgic. It is a mix. There are a lot of words that maybe are not pure Ukrainian. But again, I always say people who speak Ukrainian, they will understand Russian, they will understand Polish, they will understand Belarusian, they will understand some of the Central European languages. People who don't speak Ukrainian and only speak Russian, that door is closed. They can't relate.
I see.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one final question, which is by Robert Hager. How can Ukraine deal with the matter of national heroes like Bogdan Khmelnytsky or Stepan Bandera, who had a dark side?
There is a big discussion about it. And I think there are groups of people who believe that these people should be hero, and there are groups that believe that they shouldn't be hero. And I think it's still a long way to sort it out for, how to teach kids how to deal with it in Ukraine because of the complexity of the history, because of the complexity of all, the influences that they were coming from nationalistic people who had all the rights to love and promote Ukraine and fight for independence, and the communists who were, shifting focus. And there's no simple, nothing is very simple about Ukraine.
You're right. Life is not pictured in black and white. And, right.
I do want to say, I don't want to sound that I'm somewhere in the middle. I think Ukraine is an independent country and it suffered so much. And this colonial, imperial, shadow of Russia did so much damage that even though certain things are not complicated, anything that supports independence and unity of Ukraine should prevail. There is no middle road.
Right. Wonderful. Katya, I want to thank you very, very much for a very informative and lively conversation. And please use your link to the Long Breakup, the documentary, which is really fascinating to watch. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone who participated and also who watched my film. I really appreciate it, and I hope you learned something and you were entertained. And thank you again for having me at your series.
Perfect. So next week we have another interview. It's in the series Art Past Present, which is co-hosted by Farah Karapetian. And please note that next week it's not on Wednesday, but on Thursday, 12 o'clock Pacific time. And our guest is Meleko Mogosi, an artist and professor at Yale University's Art School, who is most well known for his large-scale paintings on topics like democracy, nationalism, colonialism, history in Southern Africa. Will be quite interesting, so I hope you can join there as well. And I wish you all a wonderful week. Bye-bye.